9. LINDELL Angel. One day back in 2022, 32-year-old LINDELL Angel approached a 51-year-old man on a busy London street and started up what seemed like an innocent conversation. Thinking nothing of it, the man entertained the discussion, and the pair agreed to get drinks together at a nearby bar that day. After enjoying a few adult beverages, the men gave each other their phone numbers and headed home. During the walk, Angel convinced his new buddy to walk down a dark street. Out of nowhere, he attacked the man and wrestled him down to the ground, putting him in a chokehold and punching him multiple times until he became unconscious. A bystander who witnessed the attack called for help. When the victim regained consciousness a few minutes later, his 145,000 Patek Philippe watch was missing, and it was finally clear why Angel wanted to be so buddy-buddy with him. He suffered multiple facial fractures after the assault. Police tracked Angel down at a nearby hotel a month later and found a large amount of cash in his possession. When he was convicted of robbery and possession of criminal property 10 months after the initial incident, the victim was still recovering from both his physical injuries and the emotional trauma the attack left him with. The court sentenced Angel to 9.5 years in prison for what he did. 8. Marissa Williams. While living with her aunt in Foster's, Alabama back in 2014, 19-year-old Marissa Williams allegedly developed a habit of inviting strangers she met online through social media to the house. After being told to stop, Williams blocked her aunt so she could no longer monitor the teenager's activity. Unamused by her niece's actions, the aunt created a fictional profile of a man named Trey Top Dog Ellis and started chatting Marissa up. The young woman took the bait, and before long she was asking Top Dog to come over to the home and have some drinks with her. She also reportedly offered to hook up with him if he paid for her $50 phone bill. The aunt's goal was to teach Marissa a lesson about stranger danger, but the situation took a sinister turn just a few days later when her niece messaged Top Dog and started venting about her anger toward her family. According to court documents, Marissa said that she wanted to leave Alabama. She then asked Top Dog to kill her aunt, the woman's fiancé, a cousin, and the family dog, and gave detailed instructions on how to get into the home through a bedroom window. Afterward, she suggested the two could run away together. Marissa's aunt decided to report the troubling conversation to the Tuscaloosa County Sheriff's Office. During questioning, the young woman admitted to the murder plot, but apologized and claimed she didn't really mean for anyone to get hurt. Authorities still charged her with solicitation of murder and took her to jail where she was held on a $30,000 bond. 4 months later, Marissa was released and sent to a youth center, where she would be kept under close watch while completing court-ordered programs. She was also banned from speaking with her aunt. 7. The Horseshoe Lake Murders. 75-year-old Sally Snowden McKay was the matriarch of a prominent wealthy family in the small community of Horseshoe Lake, Arkansas, where she ran her historic home as a bed and breakfast. One day in 1996, a visitor found McKay's car lying on its side in a ditch about a mile from her house. The windshield was cracked open as if someone had their head on it, and the engine was still running, but nobody was inside the crashed car. Recognizing it as McKay's vehicle, some locals rushed over to the woman's bed and breakfast. A pickup truck belonging to her cousin, 52-year-old Joseph Lee Baker, was backed right up near the door, and the door screen was cut open. Smoke started to spew from the house moments later, so the Good Samaritans called 911. Inside the home, first responders found the bodies of both McKay and Baker. They'd been fatally shot, and the home next door had also been broken into. The killer left behind no bullet casings, and the murder weapon was missing from the scene. But a witness later came forward with a description of the suspect, which eventually led police to a young man named Travis Lewis, whose mother was employed by the Snowden family. Just a few months earlier, Lewis had gotten caught stealing some video games from the Snowdens, and had also tried to sign and cash a check under McKay's name. It would have been a big leap for the teen to go from theft to murder, but it was enough for detectives to take a closer look at the suspect, especially after they learned Lewis was absent from school the day of the double homicide. The evidence continued to stack up against the boy, and his story changed multiple times during the investigation. Lewis tried to implicate his cousin, but DNA and fingerprint evidence traced back to Lewis every time. Authorities eventually charged him with 2 counts of capital murder. Knowing he would likely face the death penalty if convicted by a jury in court, Lewis took a deal and pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 28.5 years in prison for the double homicide. Lewis's mum believed her son was innocent, and so did many members of the Snowden family. The young man found an unlikely advocate in McKay's daughter, Martha, who believed that even if Lewis was at the scene during the attack, there had to have been another suspect involved in the murders. She wrote to Lewis in prison, and they quickly developed a friendship as pen pals. In 2018, Martha went to his parole hearing in favor of his release. Lewis was paroled, and Martha hired him on at the family's property as a groundskeeper. Things went smoothly until the early hours one morning in 2020, when Martha was found bludgeoned and stabbed to death in her home. She was 63 years old. The intruder was still there when the police arrived. He jumped out a second-story window and made an attempt to flee in his car, but the vehicle got stuck. Thinking quickly on his feet, he ditched it and jumped into the lake. Hours later, police found a body in the water. Surprise, surprise, it was Travis Lewis, the same man who killed Martha's mother 24 years earlier. An investigation found that Martha fired Travis and cut ties with him shortly before she was murdered because he'd allegedly stolen $10,000 from her. 6. Glenn Hollinshead. 54-year-old Glenn Hollinshead and his friend Peter Malloy were walking their dogs in Stoke-on-Trent one night back in 2008 when a woman approached and asked them if they knew any nearby hotels. Feeling sorry for her, Hollinshead offered to let her spend the night at his house. Tragically, she obliged. The 3 went to Hollinshead's home, where Malloy noticed that the woman, later identified as 41-year-old Swedish national Sabina Eriksson, kept looking out the window for something. Malloy left later on that night, something he'd regret. The next day, Eriksson stabbed her host in the head 4 times with a sharp kitchen knife. Hollinshead managed to live long enough to alert a neighbor, but soon succumbed to his severe injuries. Eriksson fled the scene with a hammer in hand, which she allegedly hit herself in the head with repeatedly. She led police on a brief chase before jumping off a 40-foot bridge onto a busy highway. Miraculously, she survived with just 2 broken ankles and a fractured skull. Even more shocking, though, was the fact that Eriksson had a similar brush with death just a few days earlier. She and her twin sister, Ursula, were both caught in the throes of a psychotic episode when they got on a bus from Liverpool to London. During the ride, they started behaving erratically. Police went to the scene, but let the women go after deciding they weren't a hazard to themselves or others. Not long after that, the sisters ran full speed into oncoming traffic along a busy highway. They were both hit by cars, leaving Ursula with 2 broken legs, while Sabina walked away with only minor injuries. Ursula resisted medical treatment, while Sabina became combative with police and continued trying to run back into the road. Parts of the bizarre incident were captured on camera by a BBC film crew, who just so happened to be at the scene filming for an unrelated story. Sabina pleaded guilty to trespass and assault on a police officer, and was released from custody without undergoing a psychiatric evaluation. She was looking for Ursula when she approached Hollinshead the day before his death. Authorities initially charged her with murder, but both the prosecution and the defense agreed that she was insane when she committed the crime. Her lawyers claimed that she was a secondary sufferer of a phenomenon known as folie à deux, which is when a similar or identical mental disorder affects 2 or more people who are often the member of the same family. In other words, Ursula's psychosis may have rubbed off on her twin. Sabina later pleaded guilty to manslaughter with diminished responsibility and was sentenced to serve 5 years in prison. Hollinshead's brother told the press that he believed the system failed his family by letting Sabina back onto the streets when she posed an obvious danger to herself and society. 5. Pamela Hutchinson. In April 2018, 59-year-old Pamela Hutchinson traveled to Fort Myers, Florida, so she could help a friend scatter her late husband's ashes. She was only planning to stay for a few days before going back home to Bradenton, which is about 2 hours north. During her stay, a woman claiming to be Pam called the front desk at the timeshare complex where Pamela was renting a room and extended the trip for a few more days. In the meantime, relatives went to Pam's house for a visit and found it completely dark and empty. A few days later, Pam was discovered dead in her rented timeshare with a bullet wound to the chest. Her car had been stolen, along with her credit cards and $5,000. Investigators traced her last known location to a nearby bar, where she was seen on surveillance footage talking and having drinks with a woman who looked very similar to her. Suspecting that Pam's lookalike killed her in order to steal her identity, authorities connected the crime to 56-year-old Louis Reese, a grandmother from Minnesota who was apparently already on the run for killing her husband, David. During a welfare check weeks before, police found David dead from multiple gunshot wounds at his home in Blooming Prairie. Louis was nowhere in sight. Detectives then found evidence that she had a gambling addiction and had transferred $11,000 of David's money into her personal bank account after his murder. Just days before Pam's murder, Louis showed up at the home of her friend Tess Costa in Fort Myers. Knowing that Louis was wanted in connection to her husband's death, Costa called the police, only to be bounced back and forth between law enforcement in Minnesota and Florida, with officials on each end saying they weren't responsible for the crime's case. It was later speculated that if someone had handled the matter sooner, Pam could still be alive today. Within 3 days of her murder, Louis had already lost all the money she'd stolen at a casino in Louisiana. Authorities eventually launched a nationwide manhunt for Louis, plastering billboards in multiple states with her photo. 10 days after Pam's body was discovered, a tipster spotted Louis in South Padre Island, Texas, and alerted authorities who took her into custody. Louis pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in connection to Pam's death and received a life sentence without parole. She was then extradited to Minnesota and tried for her husband's murder, which she also pleaded guilty to and received a life sentence for. After she was spared from the death penalty, prosecutors in both cases agreed to let her serve time in Minnesota. 4. Lauren Stevens. In 2022, a man in his 50s was drinking at a bar in Bulwell, England one night when he was approached outside by 28-year-old Lauren Stevens, who quickly befriended him and claimed she was homeless. He invited the young woman to sleep at his home, where they watched TV for a little while before Stevens suddenly got up and left, stating on her way out that she was going out to buy some drugs. Apparently under the impression that she wasn't coming back, the man got tired and simply went to bed. He was woken up later that night to Stevens standing over him. After coming back inside the house, this time uninvited, she struck him in the head and demanded to know where his winnings were being kept. In the meantime, she gathered up anything of potential value that included money, cigarettes, and a bank card. Stevens ordered the victim to tell her the PIN to his debit card, but he refused. His unwelcome guest made several threats before leaving the house, and he was able to report the burglary the next morning. Prosecutors accused Stevens of knowingly targeting a vulnerable individual to steal from him. She ultimately pleaded guilty to robbery and was sentenced to serve out 4 years in prison. 3. Germany's first internet killer. Back when online chat rooms first became popular, a German man in his 20s named Christian Grothe became addicted to talking to strangers online. His fantasy world soon became a substitute for his disappointing reality, since he spent years chatting up hundreds of women. He met an unknown number of them face to face and even murdered 2 of them. The first victim, 26-year-old Jessica Kay, was fatally stabbed in the summer of 2008. Grothe told authorities that they planned to meet up for a casual hookup, but that their plans were interrupted after getting into an argument. He claimed that he grabbed Jessica by the throat and that she collapsed to the ground. Grothe insisted that he didn't mean to kill her. When detectives challenged his version of the story by pointing out that Jessica had been stabbed and that her blood was found on his shoes, he said that the blood came from a nosebleed she got while they were hanging out that night. 12 days after Jessica's murder, Grothe stabbed and killed a 39-year-old mother of 3 named Regina 26 times with a bread knife. He told investigators that the victim demanded money after an intimate meeting and that he refused to pay. They apparently dropped the topic long enough to take Jessica's dog out for a walk, at which point Grothe claimed she threatened to make false assault allegations against him. He said he killed her in a blind rage and essentially tried to blame her for the death, stating that if she hadn't threatened him, she would still be alive. Prosecutors disagreed, saying that both murders were premeditated. Grothe initially tried pleading insanity, blaming his actions on a traumatic childhood, but the court rejected the notion. He was convicted of both murders. He reportedly resented the media for labeling him a serial killer, claiming that he met over 100 people from chat rooms and that 98 of them were still alive, as if that was an accomplishment. Sadly, his obsession with the internet continued after his arrest. According to Grothe's lawyer, he was obsessed with learning what people were saying about him online. He also supposedly requested to have a computer in his jail cell, which, as I'm sure you figured out by now, was a hard no. While the case of Germany's so-called first internet killer made international headlines, Grothe's sentence is unclear. Hopefully, he won't be allowed near a computer or smart device ever again. 2. Alma Beth von Steiner. When 57-year-old Alma Beth von Steiner didn't show up to a family holiday gathering back in 2009, her brother reported her missing. Police initially assumed that she skipped town for a few days without telling anyone, but they started to think differently after forcing their way into her house in Spotsylvania, Virginia, and finding multiple large bloodstains. While searching her property, they found the woman dead under a pile of garbage with blunt force injuries to her head. Witnesses reported seeing a man driving Alma's truck around and selling stolen DVDs. He was eventually identified as Benny Wayne McCroskey Jr. Alma met McCroskey through a mutual friend, Desiree Warthen, who she'd met earlier that year while serving time at a local jail. Shortly before her murder, Alma invited Warthen and McCroskey over to celebrate her birthday. While there, the house guests saw bank statements showing a large amount of money in Alma's accounts. The pair were still at the house 3 days later when Alma kicked Desiree out for trying to steal the money. McCroskey stayed behind though. Shortly after leaving Alma's house, Warthen was arrested for a public intoxication charge. She met up with McCroskey the next day and was surprised to learn that he had Alma's credit card. The man claimed that Alma had given him the card along with permission to borrow her truck. He and Desiree then went on a shopping spree. Desiree couldn't shake the feeling that something was strange about the situation. She asked McCroskey to tell her the truth, and he lashed out at her, prompting her to go to the police in fear for her life. Investigators quickly put the puzzle together and tied McCroskey to Alma's murder through DNA evidence. McCroskey entered an Alford plea to second-degree murder and grand larceny, meaning that he'd maintained his innocence but admitted that prosecutors likely had a strong enough case to convict him of the charges. He was eventually sentenced to 25 years in prison and is slated to get released in 2032. 1. Denali Bremer. In one of the most bizarre true crime cases to make headlines over recent years, a young woman from Alaska named Denali Bremer was involved with a man she met online and knew only as Tyler. The mysterious stranger claimed to be extraordinarily rich and offered Bremer $9 million to kill someone and send him photos and videos of the act. At a moment when most people would have backed out, Bremer started planning. She recruited friends Caleb Leyland and Caden McIntosh to help her carry out the murder and targeted her unsuspecting close friend, Cynthia Hoffman. During a hike in 2019, the group lured Cynthia away from the main trail, tied her up, and shot her before tossing her lifeless body into a river. McIntosh pulled the trigger, and Bremer recorded footage for her online friend Tyler. The suspects told Cynthia's family that they dropped her off at a park before destroying some of the victim's belongings to get rid of evidence. But they did a poor job at covering their tracks and were arrested within just a few days. Tyler, identified as 21-year-old Darren Shell Miller from Indiana, was also charged in connection with the murder. Bremer pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and is scheduled to be sentenced in August 2023. The cases against McIntosh, Leyland and Shell Miller are ongoing. Thanks for watching. Would you rather be stuck paying the tab after having dinner with a stranger who snuck out before the bill arrived, or meet up with someone you connected with on a dating app only to realize that they use old photos in their profile? Let me know in the comments below.